The morning I realized just how far my HOA president was willing to go, I stood in my yard holding a mug of coffee, staring at the empty space where my 6-foot privacy fence used to be. It hadn't fallen in the night. It hadn't rotted. It hadn't been destroyed by some storm. No, it had been surgically removed, post by post, panel by panel, like someone had decided my backyard was an art project they were dismantling for scrap. And sitting neatly on the curb, stacked like lumber for collection, was my fence. My entire barrier to the world gone in the span of one night. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I found myself gripping the mug so tightly the ceramic groaned under my palm. My neighbor, Karen, though her legal documents would insist on Catherine Macmillan, stood across the street in her robe, holding a leash attached to a tiny trembling Pomeranian. She was smiling at me. Not waving, not offering some sheepish apology. Just smiling like a cat that had finally cornered the bird. "Good morning," she called out, her voice sugary enough to make my teeth ache. "Looks so much more open now, doesn't it?" I didn't answer. I wasn't ready for words. My brain was cycling between disbelief and 100 sharp comebacks that would only cheapen the moment. Instead, I set my mug down on the hood of my truck, pulled out my phone, and began snapping pictures. Her smile faltered as the shutter clicked again and again. You see, Karen wasn't just my neighbor. She was the queen bee of our HOA. And while most people in this neighborhood treated HOA regulations like polite suggestions, don't leave garbage bins out too long, keep lawns moderately trimmed, Karen treated them like the 10 Commandments carved in stone. And if the stone didn't say what she wanted, she'd just chisel it herself. The fence had been my quiet rebellion. I liked my privacy. I liked grilling in peace, not waving to neighbors every time I flipped a burger. Karen, however, had been very clear at the last meeting. Our community aesthetic thrives on openness. Fences divide. We need cohesion. She said cohesion, like she was describing a military unit, not a suburban cul-de-sac. I'd nodded politely at the time and gone home to build the fence higher. Now it was gone, and she was proud of it. I walked toward her slowly, still holding the phone. "So," I said, my voice calm in that way that usually makes people nervous, "did you hire someone to do this? Or did you come over in the middle of the night with a crowbar?" Her chin lifted. The HOA voted. The fence was non-compliant. We took corrective action. She gestured vaguely down the street. Committee members. That was laughable. The committee was 3 of her friends who mostly nodded whenever she ranted about someone's paint color. But what really made my stomach turn was the smugness in her eyes. She believed she'd won. She thought she'd beaten me by tearing down what she hated. I leaned in, keeping my voice low. "Karen, do you know what trespassing is? Do you know what destruction of property is? Because the sheriff is going to be thrilled to explain it to you." Her smile faltered for the second time that morning. "You wouldn't." I took another picture, deliberately catching her face in the frame. "Oh, I would." By noon, 2 sheriff's deputies were walking my property line with clipboards. One of them muttered something about, "Never seen an HOA go this far." Karen fluttered around like a distressed peacock, insisting the HOA bylaws allowed it. The deputies weren't buying it. They handed me a case number and suggested I file in civil court. That night, I sat on my back porch, staring at the open yard that now spilled uninvited into Karen's pristine lawn. She kept her blinds open, maybe hoping I'd wave or break down. Instead, I smiled back. Because here's the thing, Karen had escalated first. And I don't play short games. I started digging. Public records, HOA bylaws, minutes from every meeting she'd ever chaired. It wasn't long before I discovered Karen's version of cohesion had less to do with community and more to do with control. The bylaws had never been properly amended to forbid fences. She'd just declared it one day, and everyone was too tired to argue. She'd also been siphoning HOA funds for landscaping improvements that happened to involve her front yard exclusively. And the piece de resistance? A lovely little lawsuit 3 years ago in her last neighborhood for, you guessed it, trespassing on a neighbor's property to correct a hedge that was too tall. I could have gone straight to the HOA board with this, but that would have been too easy. Karen thrived on neighborhood drama, and a shouting match at a meeting would only fuel her ego. I needed something cleaner, sharper. So I filed my civil suit for property damage and trespassing. Quietly. No shouting, no warning. Just a neat stack of evidence handed over to the clerk of courts. And while I was at it, I sent a packet of my findings to the county auditor's office. Weeks later, when Karen strutted up to me during another HOA meeting, her voice loud and shrill as she insisted I was a troublemaker undermining the fabric of the neighborhood, I just leaned back in my chair and let her rant. Because I already knew what was coming. The knock on her door from investigators. The subpoena for HOA financial record. The whispers spreading through the neighborhood as people realized the queen bee wasn't untouchable. And me? I sat in my now exposed yard, grilling steaks without a care in the world, sipping beer while Karen's little empire began to crack. What she didn't know yet, what nobody knew, was that the fence was only the beginning. Because if she thought I was going to stop at civil court, she hadn't been paying attention. And I always pay attention. The first time Karen realized the neighborhood wasn't standing behind her, she didn't take it quietly. That night, after the HOA meeting where she'd tried to brand me as some sort of community traitor, she showed up on my doorstep. Not a polite knock, not a neighborly check-in. She banged. Hard, rattling the glass panel in the door like she thought intimidation came in decibels. I opened the door with a half-smile, still holding the bourbon I'd been sipping, and leaned against the frame like I had all the time in the world. She didn't even bother greeting me. Her face was flushed, hair frizzed from humidity, and that Pomeranian of hers was yapping like it knew I was public enemy #1. "You think this is funny?" she demanded, waving a manicured finger like a prosecutor. "Dragging this community through the mud? Do you know what kind of damage you're doing?" I sipped, slow and calm. "Do you know what kind of damage you did when you destroyed a legally installed fence?" She actually scoffed, like scoffing was a real argument. "That fence was a blight. This neighborhood has standards, and if you don't like them, maybe you should sell your house and move somewhere without rules." I looked her dead in the eye. "Karen, I love rules. Especially the kind written in law books. You're about to learn them very well." She paled. Not much, but just enough to make me notice. Then she tried to recover with a laugh that sounded about as natural as a car alarm. "You're bluffing. Nobody sues over a fence." I didn't bother correcting her. People don't go to prison over a fence either, and yet I already knew where this road was headed. The next week was eerily quiet. Too quiet for Karen, who thrived on gossip and backyard interrogations. Normally, she would have cornered every neighbor with a glass of wine and her version of events, but instead she seemed busy. Distracted. Cars came and went from her driveway at odd hours. Not friends, not neighbors. Men in business attire carrying briefcases. She wasn't panicking yet, but she was circling the wagons. Meanwhile, the sheriff's department finished their little investigation, and my civil suit made its way into the system. That alone would have been satisfying enough, watching her squirm under the threat of writing me a 5-figure check for damages, but the real entertainment came from the county auditor's office. See, the documents I'd dropped on them weren't just some casual observations. I'd highlighted every questionable landscaping expenditure she'd signed off on. Mulch deliveries billed at triple market rate. Stone retaining walls that mysteriously matched her backyard renovation but never showed up in any common areas. And my personal favorite, $8,200 for community entryway improvement that ended up funding her brand new wrought iron gate. At first, neighbors didn't want to believe it. Karen was bossy, sure. Controlling, definitely. But a thief? That felt like too much. Until letters started arriving in their mailboxes. Formal notices requesting cooperation with an official investigation. Suddenly, People weren't laughing off my petty feud anymore. They were whispering on sidewalks, exchanging wide-eyed glances when Karen drove past in her Lexus. The shift was subtle but delicious. Karen, once the self-proclaimed guardian of our community aesthetic, was now the subject of neighborhood gossip. And Karen hated gossip when she wasn't the one spreading it. She tried damage control, of course. She marched door to door with typed clarification statements about misunderstandings in accounting and temporary reallocations of funds. Most neighbors smiled politely, then folded the papers into the recycling bin before the door shut. I even watched one of the teenagers down the street use his copy as kindling for a bonfire. But Karen wasn't just fighting embarrassment. She was fighting me. One evening, I caught her in my yard again. No tools this time, no fence sabotage. Just standing there at the edge of my lawn, glaring at me like she could melt me with sheer force of will. I turned on my porch light and raised an eyebrow. "Need something?" "You think you're clever," she hissed, her voice low enough the Pomeranian couldn't hear. "But I know what you're doing. You won't win. People like me don't lose." I laughed. Not mocking, not cruel, just genuinely amused. "Karen, you already lost. You just haven't figured it out yet." She stormed off, heels stabbing divots into my grass, and that was the last time she tried confronting me directly. After that, she moved underground. But underground isn't Karen's strong suit. She thrives in the spotlight, and when she tries subtlety, it looks about as natural as a rhinestone on a bowling ball. I caught her peeking through curtains when inspectors came by. I heard from a neighbor that she was considering suing me for defamation. She even tried to rally a petition to have me removed from the HOA entirely, something that doesn't even exist in legal reality. And while she flailed, my case gained momentum. The court date was set. Subpoenas went out. HOA records were demanded. That's when the real twist hit, one even I didn't see coming. The treasurer of the HOA, a quiet retired accountant named Robert Flip. He'd been Karen's lapdog for years, signing whatever checks she shoved under his nose. But faced with the prospect of legal trouble, he produced his own neat binder full of copies, every sketchy transaction, every receipt, every signature. He handed it over to investigators and, in the process, burned Karen's last bridge. The neighborhood found out about it almost immediately, because Robert wasn't subtle either. He stood in his driveway with the binder and explained to anyone who would listen how Karen had bullied him into going along with her schemes. Suddenly, people weren't just suspicious of Karen, they were furious. Front yards became mini town halls. Neighbors compared notes. They discovered they'd been paying inflated dues while Karen's property values skyrocketed. Parents complained about canceled playground upgrades that mysteriously aligned with her backyard renovation timeline. What had once been petty irritation turned into collective outrage. And Karen? She doubled down. She accused Robert of betrayal. She shouted at neighbors in driveways. She even posted long-winded rants on the community Facebook page about ungrateful residents sabotaging the neighborhood vision. But the more she fought, the more pathetic she looked. The sheriff's department filed criminal charges, embezzlement, fraud, and yes, trespassing. My civil suit was still on track, but suddenly it felt like a sideshow compared to the main event. Karen wasn't just looking at writing me a check. She was looking at serious jail time. I remember sitting in my yard one night, watching the sun set over the now open space where my fence used to be. The air smelled like charcoal from someone's barbecue, kids were laughing down the street, and for the first time in months, the neighborhood felt alive. It struck me then, Karen had always claimed fences divided people. But the truth was, it was her. She'd built invisible walls between everyone with her control, her petty rules, her obsession with power. And now those walls were crumbling. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd wanted openness. She'd gotten it. Everyone was open to seeing her for what she really was, open to fighting back, open to tearing down her little empire piece by piece. You'd think that facing criminal charges and an outraged neighborhood would push someone into quiet damage control. Most people, at least. But Karen wasn't most people. She had this unshakable belief that if she just yelled louder, waved more papers, and dragged more people into her orbit, she could bend reality until it fit her version of events. The first salvo came in the form of a thick manila envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a copy of a restraining order petition she'd filed against me. According to her affidavit, I was stalking, harassing, and endangering her and her small dog. She claimed I'd taken surveillance photographs of her, loitered near her home, and even made gestures that suggested I wanted to harm her. I actually laughed out loud sitting at my kitchen counter as I read it. Yes, I'd taken photos of my dismantled fence and of her standing smugly across the street. But if that was harassment, half the neighborhood should have been cuffed years ago for taking pictures of her parking violations. Still, I knew better than to underestimate the legal system. A restraining order, if granted, could complicate my own civil case. It would paint me as an aggressor, muddying the waters just enough for her to buy time. So I did what I always do. I stayed calm, I played the long game, and I showed up to court prepared. The day of the hearing, the courtroom was nearly empty except for me, Karen, her yappy lawyer, and the judge. Karen was in full performance mode, dramatic sighs, trembling hands, describing me like I was some sort of lurking predator who haunted her cul-de-sac. The lawyer nodded solemnly as though he believed every word. When it was my turn, I stood up with a binder. Dates, photos, case numbers, copies of official complaint. I explained, matter-of-factly, that the surveillance photographs were evidence I'd been advised to collect by law enforcement. I pointed out that she'd been the one trespassing, not me. I mentioned the ongoing criminal charges she was facing. And then I gently reminded the court that it would be rather difficult for someone accused of harassment to also be the documented victim of property destruction. The judge dismissed her petition before she could even fake another trembling sob. I thought that would end it. I was wrong. The very next week, Karen tried another tactic. She marched into the county zoning office and filed what's called a view easement petition. For those who've never had the misfortune of tangling with one, it's basically a legal maneuver where a neighbor can claim that something on your property, trees, structures, fences, unreasonably blocks their view and therefore lowers their property value. It's a weapon Karens keep in their arsenal, and she swung it like a hammer. Her claim? My now missing fence had permanently disrupted the neighborhood's open-concept view, and that even the idea of me rebuilding it constituted an obstruction. She argued that my property needed to remain unfenced and clear, indefinitely to preserve the community's character. When I got the notice in the mail, I nearly choked on my coffee. The sheer audacity of weaponizing zoning laws to freeze my yard in permanent openness was peak Karen. But again, dangerous. If she managed to twist enough arms in the zoning board, I'd be stuck with a yard that anyone could trample through, all because she couldn't stand the idea of me having privacy. So I showed up at the hearing, once again armed with facts. I'd done my homework. The zoning code didn't support her argument. Her petition was riddled with contradictions. And, most importantly, I brought along half a dozen neighbors who were more than happy to testify about her history of bullying and rule-bending. The zoning board denied her request unanimously. That should have been another nail in the coffin. But instead, it turned Karen desperate. And desperation is when people make mistakes. The first mistake: she tried to doctor HOA document. I know this because one evening, Robert, the treasurer who'd flipped, showed up at my door with a folder in his trembling hand. Inside were freshly amended meeting minutes claiming there had been a vote years earlier outlawing fences. Except the formatting was wrong. The signatures were photocopied. The dates didn't match up with any actual meeting. Robert, bless him, had refused to sign off and brought them to me instead. The second mistake: she got sloppy with her allies. A neighbor tipped me off that Karen had tried to bribe one of the zoning board members. She'd offered to have the HOA donate funds to his pet landscaping project in exchange for support. The neighbor overheard the conversation at a coffee shop, recognized Karen's shrill voice, and had the good sense to jot down note. The third, and biggest, mistake. She underestimated just how much the neighborhood hated her now. People weren't scared anymore. They weren't intimidated by her barking voice or her endless citations. They were angry. And angry neighbors have long memories. Stories started surfacing. How she'd fined a single mother for leaving chalk drawings on her driveway. How she'd threatened to tow a veteran's truck because it was too commercial-looking. How she'd yelled at teenagers for playing basketball past 8 p.m. It wasn't just me against Karen anymore. It was everyone. The sheriff's department, already investigating her financial shenanigans, suddenly had a buffet of new complaints to dig into: witnesses, documents, attempted bribes, falsified records. My civil suit was no longer just about offense. It was about establishing a pattern of abuse. And yet, Karen didn't stop. She couldn't. Control was her oxygen, and without it, she flailed. One night, I caught the sound of hammering around 11 p.m. I stepped outside to see Karen, in her robe again, trying to stake a "no trespassing" HOA authority sign directly into my yard. She looked wild, hair sticking out, eyes blazing with a manic determination. I didn't even yell. I just pulled out my phone, hit record, and asked calmly, "Karen, do you realize what trespassing means?" Her face drained of color. She dropped the sign and bolted. That video went straight to my lawyer. At this point, the narrative wasn't about whether Karen had overstepped. It was about how many laws she'd broken and how many counts prosecutors could stack. Fraud, embezzlement, attempted bribery, falsifying documents, trespassing. The list grew longer by the week. The neighborhood watched it all unfold like a live drama series. People set up lawn chairs to gossip. Someone joked about selling popcorn. Every time Karen tried to claw her way back into control, she only dug her hole deeper. And me? I stayed patient. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. I just kept stacking bricks, evidence, witnesses, filings, while she swung wildly at shadows. Because the beauty of people like Karen is they always believe they're one step away from victory, when in reality they're 3 steps away from collapse. And I could already see where this collapse was heading. Not just fines, not just humiliation, but handcuffs. All I had to do was let her keep talking, keep flailing, keep proving my point. And soon enough, the walls she loved to tear down were going to close in around her. The day Karen was formally arrested, you could feel the neighborhood exhale. It was like the pressure cooker that had been hissing for years finally released steam. I wasn't surprised, though. I'd been waiting for that knock on her door. And when the sheriff's cruisers rolled up her driveway at 7 in the morning, I was already on my porch sipping coffee. Karen, of course, treated it like a scene from a soap opera. She flung the door open in a silk robe, hair pinned up, shouting about constitutional rights and witch hunts, while 2 deputies tried to explain her charges calmly. Fraud, embezzlement, document tampering, trespassing. It wasn't a short list. She tried to slam the door, but they wedged it open and stepped inside. When she emerged 5 minutes later in handcuffs, her Pomeranian yapping hysterically at her feet, the cul-de-sac was lined with neighbors pretending to water lawns or collect newspapers just to watch. Karen screamed about conspiracies. She shrieked about ungrateful neighbors who didn't appreciate her sacrifices. She even turned to me, locked eyes, and yelled, "This is your doing." I raised my coffee cup in salute. The squad car pulled away, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt quiet. Too quiet, in fact. Without Karen barking orders, fining people, or patrolling with her clipboard, people didn't quite know what to do. Some were relieved. Others were cautious. After all, Karen still had her lawyer, still had her influence with a handful of die-hard loyalists. She wasn't gone yet, just temporarily sidelined. And she wasn't about to go down without dragging everyone through the mud. The first sign came a week later, when her lawyer filed a massive countersuit against me, the HOA, and even Robert the treasurer. The claim? That we were part of a coordinated conspiracy to ruin her reputation and seize control of the HOA. She demanded damages in the hundreds of thousands, alleging mental anguish, defamation, and, my personal favorite, loss of community standing. It was laughable, but again, dangerous. Courts don't always reward truth. They reward persistence, paperwork, and technicalities. Karen's lawyer was clearly hoping to stall, to muddy the waters enough to make her look like the victim. So I doubled down. My lawyer and I responded with our own mountain of filings, motions to dismiss, counterclaims, discovery demands. We piled on every piece of evidence we had. The video of her trespassing with that ridiculous sign. The doctored HOA minutes. Robert's testimony. The auditor's reports. We painted a picture of not just an entitled neighbor, but a woman systematically abusing power for years. The civil court turned into a circus. Karen showed up in blindingly bright suits, clutching folders, flanked by her dwindling supporters. She whispered loudly during proceedings, gasped theatrically when evidence was presented, and rolled her eyes whenever I spoke. At one point, she even broke down crying on the stand, claiming I'd terrorized her with my calm demeanor. The judge was not amused. Meanwhile, the criminal side of things was moving faster than anyone expected. Investigators uncovered more financial skeletons than I had anticipated. Apparently, Karen hadn't just siphoned funds from our HOA, she'd done it in her previous neighborhood too, before moving here. That lawsuit I'd found in public records? It had been settled quietly, with her promising never to volunteer for financial oversight again. And yet here she was, queen of our HOA's budget. That discovery changed everything. Suddenly, prosecutors weren't just talking fines or probation. They were talking prison time. Real, actual prison time. Karen knew it too. You could see the panic behind her eyes at the hearings. She still barked and postured, but it was hollow now. She wasn't in control anymore. She was drowning. But instead of surrendering, she made the worst mistake yet. She went on the offensive outside the courtroom. One Saturday morning, the entire neighborhood woke up to find anonymous flyers stuffed into mailboxes. Bold letters screamed, "The truth about your neighbor," and underneath were long, rambling paragraphs accusing me of everything from fraud to un-American activities. According to the flyer, I was part of some shadowy plot to destroy traditional neighborhood values. She even accused me of stockpiling weapons, which was rich considering the most dangerous thing in my house was a rusty hedge trimmer. The flyers backfired spectacularly. Neighbors were insulted that she thought they'd believe something so obviously fabricated. A few people even brought them over to me, laughing, asking if I'd really been smuggling contraband out of my garage. The best part? She'd forgotten that stuffing mailboxes with unapproved material is a federal offense. Another violation to add to her growing list. By now, Karen's loyalists had dwindled to almost nothing. Even her best friend, a woman named Linda, who used to nod along with every HOA decree, stopped showing up at court. People didn't want to be tainted by proximity. But Karen still had one last card to play. And she played it at the worst possible time. During one of the final civil hearings, as evidence piled up against her, Karen snapped. Literally snapped. She stood up mid-testimony, pointed at the judge, and screamed that the entire court was biased, that the county was corrupt, that I had bought off law enforcement. She refused to sit down, refused to stop ranting, until bailiffs had to escort her out of the courtroom. That moment sealed her fate. Whatever sliver of credibility she had left evaporated. A week later, the jury in her criminal case returned a verdict. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement, guilty of document tampering, guilty of trespassing. The sentencing was scheduled for the following month. The night after the verdict, the neighborhood threw what can only be described as a block party. People brought grills, coolers, music. Kids rode bikes up and down the street without worrying about Karen shouting about noise ordinances. It wasn't just a celebration of her downfall, it was a celebration of freedom. I stood there with a plate of ribs in one hand and a cold beer in the other, watching my neighbors laugh and smile, and I realized something important. Karen had been right about one thing. Fences do divide people. But not physical fences, She'd been the barrier between everyone for years, turning neighbors into suspects, enforcing control through fear. Without her, the neighborhood was closer than ever. But even as we celebrated, I couldn't shake one thought. Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. Sentencing was still weeks away, and if I knew her, she'd try something drastic before those prison doors shut behind her. I was right. Because 2 days later, I came home to find my truck keyed from headlight to taillight. Deep, deliberate gouges. And sitting on the windshield, under the wiper, was a note in scrawled handwriting. "You'll regret this." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. And that was the moment I realized Karen's story wasn't ending with a guilty verdict. It was going to end with her behind a prison wall. And I was going to make absolutely sure of it. I didn't call the sheriff right away when I found the note on my windshield. Not because I doubted who had left it, but because I knew exactly how to make it work in my favor. Karen had already been found guilty. Sentencing was weeks away, and her lawyer was undoubtedly begging her to keep her head down, stay quiet, and maybe earn a sliver of leniency. Instead, she doubled down with a threat that could only be described as self-destructive. It was like she couldn't breathe unless she was trying to dominate someone. I photographed the note, the scratches, the placement on the windshield, and I emailed everything straight to my lawyer. His response was one line: "This is going to bury her." But Karen wasn't content with just one act of vandalism. Over the next week, little things started happening around the neighborhood. Trash cans tipped over. Someone spray-painted the words, "Traitor," on Robert's garage door. Mail went missing from 3 houses in a row. Nobody needed Sherlock Holmes to solve it, but Karen, still technically out on bail, denied it all. She insisted she was being framed and targeted by a smear campaign. Her arrogance was breathtaking. She honestly thought she could keep breaking rules with half the county watching her every move. But I knew something she didn't. Every act of petty sabotage was being logged, photographed, and documented. The sheriff's office, already tired of her antics, was building a probation violation case before she'd even been sentenced. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had stopped fearing her completely. In fact, they'd started mocking her. Someone set up a parody Facebook page called Karen's HOA Chronicles, where people posted memes about her with captions like, "Next meeting agenda. Why the clouds aren't HOA compliant." Another neighbor stuck a sign in their yard that read, "No fences. No fun. All hail Queen Karen." People drove past her house just to honk in derision. Karen responded the only way she knew how, by lashing out. She screamed at kids riding scooters past her driveway. She called the sheriff 3 times in 1 week to report loiterers near her lawn. She even accused the mail carrier of conspiring against her when her subscription magazines stopped arriving, a problem she had caused herself by stealing mail. I watched it all play out like theater, calm and unshaken, because I knew where this train was headed. Finally, sentencing day arrived. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers and officials, but with half the neighborhood. People wanted to see the queen be dethroned for good. Karen walked in wearing a stiff navy dress and pearls, trying to project dignity, but her eyes betrayed her. They were wild, darting, desperate. The judge read through the list of convictions: fraud, embezzlement, document tampering, trespassing, probation violations, and then he paused before the sentence. "Mrs. McMillan, your repeated disregard for the law, your manipulation of your community, and your unwillingness to take responsibility leave this court with no choice. You are hereby sentenced to 4 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole before 2. The gasp that went through the room was collective. Karen staggered, actually staggered like someone had hit her in the chest. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice cracking with disbelief, she shouted, "This is an outrage! I made that neighborhood what it is. You're ruining everything." The bailiff stepped forward, hand on her arm. She tried to wrench free, shrieking that she was the victim of a conspiracy, that I had orchestrated everything. She turned to me, eyes blazing with hatred, and spat out words I'll never forget. "You will regret this for the rest of your life." I didn't flinch. I didn't smirk. I simply met her gaze and said, calm as ever, "Enjoy your open yard, Karen." The courtroom erupted in laughter, even the judge fighting back a smile as the bailiff led her away. That should have been the end of it. But with Karen, nothing was ever that clean. 2 days after sentencing, her lawyer filed an appeal. Of course he did. He argued that Karen had been unfairly maligned by neighbors, that the court had been biased by community gossip. But the appeal went nowhere. The evidence was too strong, the witnesses too many, the paper trail too damning. Within a month, it was denied. And so Karen began her prison sentence. You might think the story ends there, but what happened afterward was almost as satisfying as the trial itself. With Karen gone, the HOA held an emergency election. For the first time in years, the neighborhood came together not out of fear but out of genuine community spirit. Robert, the treasurer who had blown the whistle, was nominated for president, and the vote was unanimous. Under his leadership, the HOA actually started functioning the way it was supposed to, fixing the playground, repairing sidewalks, even organizing community events. I rebuilt my fence. Taller this time, sturdier, with reinforced posts sunk deep into concrete. Nobody objected. In fact, neighbors stopped by to compliment it, saying it looked sharp and gave the street more character. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very symbol Karen tore down was now standing taller than ever, approved and admired by the same community she claimed to protect. As for Karen, prison life stripped away her last illusions of control. Word trickled back through local papers that she struggled behind bars, clashing with other inmates, filing complaints about everything from food portions to cell lighting. The same personality that made her intolerable in suburbia made her unbearable in confinement. Rumors said she was nicknamed the Warden by other inmates, a cruel joke about her obsession with rules. Every now and then, I'd get a letter. Not from her, she wouldn't waste ink on me, but from reporters wanting comments on the HOA scandal. I always declined. I wasn't interested in fame. My satisfaction came from watching the neighborhood thrive without her. The last time I saw Karen, it was purely by chance. I was driving past the county courthouse months later, and a prison transport van was parked out front. Through the wire-covered window, I caught a glimpse of her face. No pearls, no lipstick, no superiority. Just a woman in an orange jumpsuit, staring blankly at the world outside. For a moment, I wondered if she still believed she'd win somehow, if she still thought she was destined to come back and reclaim her crown. But then the van pulled away and the thought vanished. The truth is, Karen had wanted openness all along. She wanted my yard open, my life open, my choices open to her scrutiny. She wanted every neighbor's privacy stripped away, every decision filtered through her control. She thought tearing down fences meant power. Now she had all the openness in the world. A prison yard, high walls looming around her, and nothing left to command. As for me, I sit behind my new fence on warm evenings, sipping a drink, listening to the laughter of neighbors who finally feel free. My yard is mine again, my neighborhood is stronger, and the only wall Karen has left to stare at is concrete, cold and unyielding. And I can't think of a more fitting ending.